At 47, Hannah Brooks had exactly $327 left to her name after signing the divorce papers that ended 24 years of marriage. She drove into a forgotten Colorado mining town with no real plan. Spent $120 on an abandoned mining office everyone else considered worthless, and listened as the locals quietly wondered why anyone would throw away their last dollars on a collapsing building. She thought she had bought nothing more than a roof over her head, but while pulling up loose floorboards beneath an old record desk, she uncovered a locked metal box filled with MINERS family letters that had been hidden for more than a century. What those letters revealed would force an entire town to rewrite its own history. But before I tell you what Hannah found inside that box, let me know where you're watching from, what time it is where you are, and if you enjoy true stories about forgotten American history, please subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Now, let's go back to the day Hannah lost almost everything. Hannah Brooks folded the final divorce document with steady hands, though nothing about the morning felt steady. 24 years of marriage had ended in less than 15 minutes inside a county courthouse. There had been no shouting, no dramatic farewell, only signatures, polite words from attorneys, and the quiet realization that she was walking away with everything she still owned, packed into the back of a 12-year-old SUV. Before leaving the parking lot, she checked her bank account one last time. $327.18 remained. She stared at the number for several seconds before locking her phone and placing it on the passenger seat. It was not enough to start over, but it was all she had. For years, she had worked as an insurance claims adjuster, building a life that had seemed dependable until it slowly unraveled. The divorce had required selling their house, dividing retirement savings, and paying legal fees she had never imagined facing. Friends encouraged her to stay nearby, rent a small apartment, and look for another office job. Hannah considered it, but every familiar street reminded her of plans that no longer existed. She wanted distance more than comfort. 2 days later, she loaded the last of her belongings into the SUV and headed west without a destination beyond finding somewhere affordable enough that she would not spend every remaining dollar in the first month. She avoided interstate highways whenever possible, following smaller roads through mountain towns whose busiest years had long passed. On the third afternoon, she entered an old mining community nestled beneath steep hills streaked with abandoned tram lines and weathered rock cuts. Most storefronts stood empty. Rusted mining equipment had been placed beside sidewalks as reminders of another era. A faded wooden sign welcomed visitors before adding, "Historic District." Hannah smiled faintly. The town looked worn but stubborn, refusing to disappear completely. She stopped at a small diner to order coffee and the least expensive meal on the menu. While waiting, she noticed a handwritten notice taped beside the cash register. County surplus auction, Saturday morning. Old mining properties. Curiosity led her to ask the waitress about it. "Mostly old buildings nobody wants anymore," the woman answered while refilling coffee cups. "Storage sheds, workshops, things left over after the mine closed decades ago." "Anything livable?" Hannah asked. The waitress laughed softly. "Depends how much work you don't mind doing." Hannah folded the flyer and slipped it into her jacket pocket. She had no reason to attend except that she had nowhere else to be. Saturday morning arrived cool and clear. Fewer than 30 people gathered outside the county maintenance garage where photographs of each property had been displayed on portable boards. Most bidders appeared to know one another. They talked comfortably about fencing, timber, and restoration projects, while Hannah quietly examined each listing. Many properties sold for more than she could possibly afford. Then she reached one final display near the end of the row. The photograph showed a narrow wooden building standing alone above the abandoned mine road. The caption simply read, "Former mining office. Structural repairs required. No utilities connected." Hannah studied the image. Despite peeling paint and broken windows, the building still stood squarely on its foundation. A small porch faced the mountains, and a faded sign remained attached above the entrance. She imagined clerks once tracking shipments, payrolls, and maps inside those walls while miners came and went through the doorway. The auction began. Equipment sold first, followed by storage buildings and vacant lots. Hannah kept her hands in her pockets, reminding herself she could not afford mistakes. Finally, the auctioneer announced the mining office. Bidding opened at $100. Silence followed. A few people exchanged amused looks. "100!" the auctioneer repeated. Hannah slowly raised her bidder card. "100 I've got," the auctioneer called. "Do I hear 120? Another long pause settled over the crowd before a man near the back lifted his card almost playfully. 120. Hannah hesitated. Spending more than 1/3 of everything she owned on an abandoned building seemed impossible to justify. Yet something about letting it disappear into another joke purchase felt equally wrong. She raised her card once more. 120. The auctioneer glanced around. The other bidder smiled and lowered his card. "Going once. Going twice. Sold." A few quiet chuckles drifted through the crowd as paperwork was completed. An older man standing nearby shook his head with a friendly smile. "Ma'am," he said, "that office has been empty longer than most of us can remember. Hope you like repairing roofs." Hannah smiled politely. "I'm learning." Another resident added, "At least you've got yourself a good view." Nobody sounded cruel. They simply believed she had paid for a problem no sensible person wanted. After signing the transfer documents and paying $120, Hannah checked her account again. $207 remained. It was frighteningly little. But for the first time in weeks, she possessed something that belonged entirely to her. The road leading to the mining office climbed gradually above town before ending beside the weathered building. Tall grass surrounded the porch. One shutter hung crookedly from rusted hinges. The front door resisted before opening with a tired groan. Dust floated through shafts of afternoon sunlight, entering broken windows. Inside stood an old cast-iron stove, several empty shelves, and a heavy wooden record desk positioned near the center of the room. Time had removed almost everything else. Hannah spent the remainder of the afternoon sweeping debris into piles, opening windows, and carrying broken boards outside. The work left her exhausted, yet each cleaned corner made the building feel slightly more welcoming. As evening settled across the mountains, she unfolded a sleeping bag beside the stove and ate crackers with canned soup warmed over a small camping burner. The silence felt unfamiliar but peaceful. Before lying down, she walked once more around the office, flashlight in hand, checking for leaks and loose boards she might repair the following day. When she stepped behind the old record desk, the floor gave a faint, hollow sound beneath one foot. She stopped. Kneeling carefully, she brushed away years of dust and noticed that one narrow plank did not match the others. The edges showed tiny pry marks almost hidden beneath old dirt. Using the claw of a hammer from her toolbox, Hannah slowly lifted the loose board. Beneath it rested a small metal document box secured with a rusted lock. Hidden in darkness beneath the floor, exactly where no casual visitor would ever think to look. Morning sunlight filtered through the cracked windows of the mining office, casting long bands of light across the dusty floor, where the loose board still leaned against the old record desk. Hannah woke stiff from sleeping on the wooden floor. But her first thought was not about breakfast or the roof that leaked above the back corner. It was the locked, metal document box hidden beneath the floorboards. She knelt beside it again, brushing away more dirt that had collected around its edges. The box was surprisingly heavy for its size. Rust covered the hinges, and the small brass lock had darkened almost black with age. There were no markings except a faint number stamped into one corner. She carried it into the morning light outside, hoping the fresh air would help her see it more clearly. The lock refused to move. She searched through her small toolbox, trying several screwdrivers without success. Finally, she positioned a narrow chisel beneath the weakened hasp and tapped it gently with a hammer. The old metal resisted at first, then gave way with a sharp snap. Hannah paused before lifting the lid. She had expected forgotten receipts, perhaps old payroll forms or empty folders. Instead, she found several carefully wrapped bundles tied with faded cotton string. Each bundle contained neatly folded handwritten letters protected inside oilcloth that had kept moisture away for decades. She unfolded the first page with great care. The paper had yellowed, but the ink remained surprisingly clear. The letter was written in careful cursive, dated more than a century earlier, and signed simply by a woman named Clara. She was writing to her husband, who worked underground at the mine. The letter spoke about their young children, shortages at the general store, and hope that winter would soon end. There was nothing dramatic in the words, only ordinary family life preserved across generations. Hannah slowly opened another letter. This one came from a miner writing to his brother in another state. He described long shifts, dangerous conditions, and gratitude that the mining office clerk always made sure wages reached the workers on time. Several more letters followed. Some carried names. Others were unsigned drafts that appeared never to have been mailed. None looked like official business records. They felt deeply personal. Hannah carefully returned every page to its protective wrapping. Whoever had hidden them had done so deliberately. The letters had not been abandoned by accident. They had been preserved. She realized she needed someone who understood the town's history better than she did. After securing the box beneath a blanket in her SUV, she drove back into town. The waitress from the diner recognized her immediately. "How's the old office?" she asked with a smile. "Still standing," Hannah replied. "Is there a local museum?" "Small one," the waitress answered. "Mostly mining history. Eleanor Price runs it as a volunteer. She's there most afternoons." The museum occupied what had once been the town's railroad depot. Though modest in size, it contained carefully arranged displays of mining tools, photographs, maps, and household items donated by former residents. An elderly woman with silver hair looked up from cataloging several artifacts as Hannah entered. "Welcome," she said warmly. "I'm Eleanor." Hannah introduced herself and explained that she had recently purchased the abandoned mining office. Eleanor's eyebrows rose with pleasant surprise. "I wondered who finally bought it." Hannah hesitated before describing the hidden document box. Rather than bringing it inside immediately, she first asked whether the office had ever been fully searched after the mine closed. Eleanor shook her hand. "Not completely. When operations ended, most company records were shipped away. The building itself sat empty for years. People assumed anything important had already been removed." Hannah retrieved the carefully wrapped bundles from her vehicle. Eleanor cleared a large table before helping unfold the first letters. She immediately reached for a pair of cotton gloves before touching the fragile paper. Together they examined the handwriting, dates, and envelopes. Eleanor's expression gradually shifted from simple curiosity to quiet astonishment. "These aren't company correspondence," she said softly. "They're family letters." Hannah nodded. "I thought the same." Eleanor carefully examined one envelope after another. "I've cataloged hundreds of mining records over the years, but I've never seen these." She disappeared briefly into a storage room before returning with several archive binders listing every known collection donated to the museum. Methodically, she checked names, dates, and descriptions. Nothing matched the letters lying on the table. "They were never cataloged," she said at last. "As far as I can tell, no one even knew they existed." Hannah felt a strange mixture of excitement and responsibility. She had stumbled across something valuable, not because of money, but because the letters represented voices no one had heard in generations. Eleanor carefully opened another bundle. Several letters appeared to have been written by employees working inside the mining office itself. One discussed keeping records late into the evening. Another thanked a clerk for helping deliver supplies to struggling families. Hannah noticed a repeated phrase appearing in several different letters. "The families after the collapse." She pointed toward the sentence. Eleanor adjusted her glasses and reread it carefully. "That's unusual." "Why?" Hannah asked. Eleanor walked toward one display case containing a timeline of the town's history. "The mine experienced accidents over the years, but the official records describe only one major collapse. It was tragic, but the company reports mainly discuss repairs and production losses." She looked back at the letter. "There's almost nothing about organized aid for families afterward." Together, they continued reading. The writers spoke about collecting food, sharing blankets, and helping children through the winter. The tone suggested an organized effort among ordinary workers rather than something directed by the mining company. Yet Eleanor could remember no museum exhibit or archived record describing such an effort. The letters quietly filled a gap the official history had left empty. As afternoon light faded across the museum windows, Eleanor unfolded one final envelope from the bottom of the first bundle. Unlike the others, this letter appeared unfinished. The final paragraph ended abruptly after mentioning several documents that had been kept safe. Hannah leaned closer as Eleanor slowly read the last complete sentence aloud. "The register contains every family's name. If anything happens to me, make certain it is never lost." Eleanor lowered the page carefully onto the table. She looked at Hannah with thoughtful concern. "I've never heard of any register like that." Hannah looked down at the forgotten letters spread between them, the names, the families. And now a missing register had all remained hidden beneath the floor of the abandoned mining office for more than a century. The final sentence of the unfinished letter lingered in Hannah's thoughts long after she returned to the mining office that evening. "The register contains every family's name." Whoever had written those words believed the register mattered just as much as the letters themselves. She carefully placed every bundle back inside the metal document box before locking it inside a cabinet she had repaired that afternoon. The office no longer felt like an abandoned building. It felt like a place that had been entrusted with something important. The following morning, Eleanor introduced Hannah to Daniel Reed, the local high school history teacher. Daniel often volunteered at the museum during school breaks and had spent years researching the region's mining communities. After Eleanor explained the discovery, Daniel carefully examined several copies of the letters, rather than the fragile originals. He read quietly for several minutes before looking up. "These people left names, dates, and family relationships," he said. "That gives us somewhere to start." Eleanor spread several county census books across a large table inside the museum's archive room. Daniel opened his laptop to compare digitized records while Hannah organized copies of the letters by date. Their first goal was simple: determine whether the people mentioned in the correspondence appeared anywhere in surviving public records. The work proved slow. Many names had common spellings. Others appeared differently from one document to another. Families moved frequently during the mining years, making it difficult to follow them across decades. Still, patterns gradually emerged. Several writers appeared in census records only briefly before disappearing entirely. Others listed occupations connected to the mine, but left no indication of where they went after the operation closed. Daniel leaned back thoughtfully after comparing another set of records. It's as if parts of the community simply faded from the paperwork. Hannah remembered the ordinary hopes expressed in the letters the children: winter supplies, birthday wishes, and family meals. Those people had lived real lives, yet many seemed to vanish from official history almost overnight. Eleanor retrieved church baptism records preserved by a nearby parish. Several children's names matched those mentioned in Clara's letters. Marriage records confirmed additional family relationships. The letters were proving remarkably accurate. They described people whose lives could still be traced, even if only in scattered fragments. As the afternoon progressed, a visitor entered the museum carrying a small donation box. Eleanor greeted him warmly. "Miguel, good to see you." The man smiled before noticing the documents spread across the table. Eleanor introduced him to Hannah and Daniel. "Miguel Alvarez's grandparents lived here before the mine closed," she explained. "His family has kept photographs and stories for generations." Hannah briefly described the discovery beneath the mining office floor. Miguel listened with growing interest until Daniel mentioned several family names from the letters. Suddenly, Miguel stopped him. "Would you read that one again?" Daniel repeated the name slowly. Miguel remained silent for a moment before nodding. "That was my grandfather." He spoke almost cautiously, as though afraid he might be mistaken. "My mother used to tell us he worked in the mine before leaving town. We never had many official records because most of the family's papers disappeared after he died." Eleanor carefully handed Miguel a copy of the letter mentioning his grandfather. He studied the familiar surname for a long time. "I've only seen his handwriting once before," he said quietly. "This isn't his letter, but these are people he would have known." Hannah watched emotion soften his expression. The discovery had suddenly become personal. Miguel returned the page carefully before promising to search through boxes stored in his attic. "My grandmother kept everything," he said. "If there's anything connected to these families, I'll find it." Over the next several days, Hannah divided her time between repairing the mining office and helping Daniel compare additional records. She patched broken windows with temporary boards, swept decades of dust from unused corners, and repaired sections of the porch one plank at a time. Each evening, she carried copies of newly identified names back to the museum. Their growing list slowly expanded. Some families could be followed into neighboring counties. Others simply disappeared after the mine's final years. One afternoon, Daniel unfolded another letter that had received little attention because of water stains along its edges. Holding it beneath a reading lamp revealed faint pencil markings almost invisible under ordinary light. They were not part of the letter itself, but appeared to be directions added later. Eleanor adjusted her glasses. "Those aren't sentences." Daniel nodded. "They look more like location notes." The faded writing referred to shelves, numbered boxes, and something abbreviated simply as P.L. Hannah compared the markings with several other letters. The same initials appeared twice more. Miguel arrived later that afternoon carrying old family photographs and a worn wooden cigar box filled with keepsakes. Among them was a faded notebook belonging to his grandfather. Most of its pages contained ordinary household expenses and work schedules. Near the back, however, one brief entry caught everyone's attention. Mr. Evans moved the payroll books below after the office closed, said they would be safer there. Daniel looked up immediately. Below? Miguel shrugged. That's all it says. Hannah spread an old insurance map of the mining office across the table, one she had found in county property files while researching repairs. The building appeared small, but the drawing showed a narrow storage space beneath the rear section of the office. She traced the outline with one finger. There's a room under the building. Eleanor studied the faded blueprint carefully. I always assumed it was only a crawl space. Daniel compared the map with the faint location notes written on the letters. Several measurements matched the dimensions shown beneath the office. He smiled with quiet excitement. I don't think they were talking about shelves inside the office. Hannah folded the blueprint carefully. The hidden metal box beneath the floorboards had preserved the letters. Now the letters themselves appeared to be pointing toward another place beneath the same building. Whatever had once been stored there had remained undisturbed for generations, waiting beneath the mining office she had bought for $120. The next morning, Hannah unlocked the mining office before sunrise. The faded blueprint lay open across the old record desk beside Miguel's grandfather's notebook, and copies of the letters containing references to numbered boxes, shelves, and the initials PL. Daniel arrived carrying flashlights, measuring tape, a camera, and a small level. Eleanor followed with cotton gloves, archival folders, and sheets of acid-free paper. Miguel came last, with work gloves and a pry bar. They spoke quietly, not from fear, but because the building seemed to demand patience. Daniel measured the rear section of the office according to the blueprint, while Hannah tapped each floorboard with the handle of a hammer. Most produced a dull, solid sound. Near the back wall, beneath a heavy shelf, one section answered with a hollow echo. Together they emptied the shelf and slid it aside. Years of dust concealed a square outline in the floor. 2 rusted iron rings lay flat against the wood. That's not a crawl space panel, Daniel said. It was meant to be opened. Hannah pulled one ring, but the hatch did not move. Miguel worked the pry bar beneath the edge and applied slow pressure. The wood lifted with a long groan, releasing a breath of cool, dry air from below. Daniel shone his flashlight into the opening. Narrow wooden steps descended into darkness. He tested the first 2 carefully, then looked back at Hannah. They're old, but they're holding. Hannah went first. Daniel followed, then helped Eleanor down while Miguel remained near the opening until everyone had reached the floor. The underground room was larger than the blueprint suggested. Stone foundation walls enclosed a dry storage area beneath the rear half of the office. Heavy beams crossed the low ceiling. Shelves lined 2 walls, some leaning but still upright. Broken lanterns, rusted tools, and empty wooden crates lay scattered across the floor. Dust coated everything, yet there was little moisture damage. Against the far wall stood 3 narrow cabinets with wooden doors. Daniel photographed the room before anyone touched anything. Eleanor reminded them to move slowly and leave every object in place until it had been documented. Hannah approached the first cabinet and pulled gently. The swollen door resisted before opening with a soft crack. Inside were thick payroll books arranged by year. Eleanor's expression changed immediately. These should have been transferred with the company records. She removed the first volume with both hands and placed it on a clean board resting across two crates. The ledger contained columns of names, occupations, hours, deductions, and wages. Daniel compared several entries with the names from the family letters. They matched. Miguel leaned over the page until he found his grandfather's surname. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he touched the margin beside the name without touching the ink. "My mother used to say he worked timber support underground," he whispered. The occupation column listed him as a timberman. Miguel swallowed. She was right. The discovery softened the room. Until that moment, the ledgers had been records. Now one line had returned a piece of Miguel's family to him. They examined the remaining books in order. The entries continued regularly until the date connected to the collapse mentioned in the letters. Then the payroll stopped almost immediately. No gradual reduction, no final settlements. 1 week contained a complete list of workers. The next offered only a brief notation stating that operations were suspended. Hannah compared the dates with the letters describing food, blankets, and help delivered to families after the disaster. "If the payroll ended here," she said, "the assistance had to be recorded somewhere else." Eleanor nodded, unless the company wanted no formal record of it. The second cabinet contained financial summaries, shipping receipts, and supply orders. Several documents showed cash withdrawals made weeks after the mine officially stopped operating. The descriptions were vague: household provisions, emergency transport, winter fuel, medical support. No recipients were named. Daniel arranged the documents by date and noticed that several withdrawals matched references inside the letters. A request for blankets appeared 2 days before a letter thanking workers for warm bedding. A payment for wagon transport aligned with a note about moving injured men and their families. "The letters and the financial records support each other," he said. "But neither tells us who received the help." Hannah felt the excitement of finding evidence, followed immediately by frustration. The names were always just beyond reach. Eleanor photographed every page before returning it to its exact position. "We have a pattern," she said, "not a conclusion." They opened the third cabinet. It contained more payroll books, including the final ledger from the mine's last operating year. At first, the entries appeared normal. Near the back, however, Daniel stopped turning pages. Several sheets were lighter than the surrounding paper. The ink was darker, and the handwriting less precise. Eleanor examined the binding closely. These pages were added later. Hannah looked at the stitched edge. Narrow remnants of older paper remained trapped beneath the replacements. The original sheets had been removed. The substituted pages covered the weeks immediately after the collapse and listed only total amounts, never individual names. Miguel stared at the altered section. Someone took out the part that would show who was paid. No one answered. The financial withdrawals proved that money continued to move. The family letters described organized support. Yet the payroll section that might have connected those facts had been deliberately replaced. A vehicle approached outside, and a few minutes later, a man called from the office above. Hannah climbed up and found Thomas Granger, chairman of the local historical preservation board, standing near the open hatch. Eleanor had informed him that they intended to inspect the storage room. Thomas listened carefully as Hannah explained what they had found. He remained professional, neither dismissing the discovery nor accepting their interpretation. "Old records can be altered for many reasons," he said. "Damage, corrections, later bookkeeping." Daniel joined them. The replaced pages cover the exact period after the collapse. Thomas looked toward the documents below. "That makes them important. But it does not prove why they were changed." Document everything before anyone speaks publicly. Hannah heard caution rather than hostility. That's what we're doing. Thomas nodded. Good. Because once families hear that names may have been removed, this becomes more than a museum question. After he left, they returned underground and finished photographing the cabinets. As they prepared to close the room, Miguel removed a weathered diary from his bag. It had belonged to his grandmother. Most entries described meals, weather, sickness, and household expenses, but one page was marked with a faded ribbon. Eleanor read the entry aloud. The men still bring flour and coal after dark. The clerk keeps the true names apart from the company books. He says the second ledger is safer where only honest hands will find it. The words settled over them. The replaced payroll pages were not the only record. Somewhere, a second ledger had preserved the names someone else had tried to erase. The phrase second ledger gave them a clear purpose, but not a clear place to begin. By Monday morning, Hannah, Daniel, Eleanor, and Miguel were seated inside the county archive with copies of the mine payroll books, the family letters, Miguel's grandmother's diary, and the old blueprint spread across a long wooden table. Eleanor had arranged access in advance, explaining that several mining company collections remained restricted because they had never been fully cataloged. The archivist on duty led them through a locked door into a colder storage room lined with gray record boxes and metal shelving. Some of this material was transferred after the company dissolved, she warned. Water damage, missing labels, mixed inventories. You may find useful records, but you may also find nothing. Hannah understood the caution. Years of insurance work had taught her that the most important document was often buried beneath dozens that seemed unrelated. They began with company financial files from the months surrounding the collapse. Daniel checked dates while Eleanor reviewed collection numbers. Miguel searched for family names. Hannah opened each folder carefully, recording every relevant reference before moving to the next. The first boxes contained routine expenses for timber, explosives, tools, and rail transport. Several folders had been damaged by moisture. Pages clung together at the edges, forcing Eleanor to separate them with a thin archival spatula. Other records had faded so badly that they could be read only beneath angled light. Progress was slow, and by midday they had found nothing that mentioned a second ledger. Hannah felt frustration rising but kept working. The underground storage room had already proved that the official record was incomplete. The absence of an easy answer did not mean the answer had never existed. In the fourth box, Daniel found a monthly account summary dated 3 weeks after the mine's official closure. It listed several large cash withdrawals authorized from a company emergency fund. No purpose was given beyond brief descriptions: relief supplies, transport, winter needs. Hannah compared the dates with the letters found beneath the office floor. One withdrawal occurred the day before a miner wrote that several widows had received flour and coal. Another matched a letter describing medicine purchased for injured workers. These payments continued after the mine supposedly stopped operating, Daniel said. Eleanor nodded, though her expression remained cautious. The dates support the letters. We still need something identifying who received the money. Miguel turned through another folder and found smaller handwritten vouchers signed only with initials. Some carried amounts too modest for equipment purchases, but consistent with food, rent, or household support. One voucher repeated every 2 weeks for nearly 6 months. Hannah placed the pages in chronological order. The payments formed a steady pattern, hidden among ordinary company expenses. Someone had continued distributing money long after wages officially ended. Yet every recipient line had been left blank. The missing names troubled Miguel most. "My grandfather may have helped deliver this," he said. But without the names, families could still be forgotten. Hannah looked at the old diary beside him. That may be why the clerk kept another ledger. Their next task was locating records from the company's private accounting office. The archive inventory showed several boxes stored in a restricted basement section because mold had been discovered years earlier. Access required protective masks, gloves, and supervision. The archivist hesitated before approving the request. "You'll have limited time," she said, "and nothing can leave the room." They descended to a lower level where the air smelled faintly of paper, dust, and disinfectant. Plastic sheeting separated damaged collections from the rest of the archive. Some boxes had collapsed under their own weight. Others were sealed inside protective containers. Eleanor selected only those connected to payroll, emergency expenses, and correspondence. The practical difficulties multiplied quickly. Several ledgers had warped covers that would not open fully. A box marked with the correct year contained tax documents from a different company. Another inventory number led to an empty shelf. Daniel checked the catalog twice before accepting that the missing container had likely been moved decades earlier without notation. Hannah reminded herself not to let disappointment become carelessness. They photographed labels, recorded gaps, and continued. Near the end of their allotted time, Eleanor found a narrow account book wedged inside a larger damaged box. Its spine carried no title, but the first pages listed cash transfers from the mine's central office. The withdrawals matched those already discovered upstairs. Later entries continued for more than a year after the mine closed. Some were approved by the chief clerk, whose initials appeared repeatedly in the family letters. Daniel leaned closer. "This proves the payments weren't accidental." Anna followed the columns until the final section. The amounts increased during winter, then gradually declined. Several entries included short notes such as family coal, medical, and rail fare east. The information came closer than anything else to explaining how the workers had supported the affected households. Then the record stopped. The final numbered pages were gone. Only torn paper remained beside the binding thread. Eleanor examined the damage. These weren't lost to water. The cuts were clean and deliberate. Someone had removed the last pages containing the most detailed period of payments. Miguel stared at the empty space. Again, Hannah understood his anger. First, the payroll pages had been replaced. Now the final account pages were missing. Every time the records approached the names of the families, the evidence disappeared. Still, the surviving entries mattered. They showed that money continued to leave company accounts long after public operations ended, and that those payments were connected to household relief rather than mining production. Before returning the book, Daniel checked the damaged box for loose sheets. At the bottom, he found an old inventory card folded beneath several blank forms. Most of the writing described accounting volumes already present. One final notation had been added in different ink. Eleanor read it twice before passing it to Hannah. Family correspondence and relief register stored separately by order of chief clerk. Beneath the sentence appeared only 3 words: office wall file. The words office wall file sent Hannah back to the mining office with more certainty than any clue before it. The next morning, she stood in the center of the room with the old inventory card resting beside the blueprint. While Daniel measured the walls and Eleanor examined the building's surviving fixtures, Miguel walked slowly along the interior, tapping boards and studying every seam. The phrase sounded simple, but the office contained several possible wall sections where records might once have been stored. Some had shelves fixed directly to the timber. Others had been patched during later repairs. Hannah began with the wall behind the record desk, reasoning that a clerk would have wanted important documents close at hand. They removed the empty shelves one at a time, photographing their original positions before setting them aside. The boards behind them were solid. Daniel checked the wall near the stove, then the narrow section beside the back window. Nothing appeared unusual. By midday, they had found old nails, mouse nests, and a rusted key that opened nothing, but no hidden file. Frustration settled quietly over the room. Hannah feared they had misunderstood the notation, or that the compartment had been emptied long before she arrived. Eleanor reminded her that hidden storage was often designed to resemble ordinary construction. "Don't search for a door," she said. "Search for something built differently." Hannah stepped outside to study the structure from the porch. The office was narrow, and the exterior wall measured slightly longer than the interior room. Daniel repeated the measurements twice. There was a difference of nearly 8 inches along the wall behind the old record desk. "That's enough for a shallow compartment," he said. Back inside, Hannah examined the vertical planks more closely. One section carried nail heads arranged too evenly, almost like decoration. The wood matched the surrounding wall, but the grain ran in the opposite direction. Miguel slipped a thin blade beneath the edge and felt it move. Together they loosened the nails carefully, preserving each one. The narrow panel came free with a dry whisper, revealing a dark cavity between the interior boards and the outer wall. Inside stood several wooden document trays stacked vertically. Dust covered their edges, but oilcloth protected the contents. Hannah reached in and removed the first bundle. More letters emerged, dozens of them, tied with string and labeled by family surname. Eleanor's breath caught. These were organized. Daniel lifted another packet. The envelopes contained both letters sent by mining families and replies written by workers, clerks, and townspeople who had arranged assistance after the collapse. Some asked for coal. Others requested medicine, train fare, or temporary lodging. Several included thank you notes written months later from families who had managed to begin again elsewhere. The letters transformed vague financial entries into individual lives. Names appeared beside needs, dates, and amounts. One widow wrote that her children had eaten because miners from another shift shared their wages. A wounded worker thanked the office clerk for sending money to his parents without placing his name in company records. Miguel found a letter bearing his grandfather's signature. In it, he promised to deliver flour to 3 households and asked that no family be made to feel ashamed for accepting help. Miguel read the page twice before lowering it. He never told anyone about this. Hannah touched his arm gently. Maybe he didn't think of it as something worth boasting about. The hidden compartment held several folders of receipts that matched the unexplained withdrawals discovered in the county archive. Each receipt carried a family name, a date, and a simple purpose. Coal, rent, medicine, burial costs, transportation. Eleanor arranged the papers in sequence while Daniel compared them with the letters and surviving financial summaries. The records supported one another with remarkable consistency. Yet the second ledger itself was not there. Hannah searched the bottom trays, finding only correspondence and small notebooks used for temporary calculations. At the back of the final tray lay a packet of personal papers written in the same hand. Eleanor recognized the signature of the mine's chief clerk, Samuel Evans, whose initials appeared on the financial records and in Miguel's grandmother's diary. These letters had never been mailed. They read more like private statements composed by a man who feared the official record was being reshaped around him. Evans described pressure from company officials to keep relief payments outside regular payroll books. He wrote that immigrant miners were being blamed publicly for the collapse, despite repeated safety complaints and faulty support timbers reported before the accident. He never named a single official. Instead, he focused on preserving the names of families, workers, and volunteers whose actions might otherwise disappear. They want the disaster remembered as carelessness below, one letter stated, not as neglect above. Hannah felt the sentence settle heavily inside her. Evans explained that he had separated the family correspondence from company files because he believed the main records would eventually be altered or removed. The letters were hidden in the office wall so the personal truth would survive, even if official documents did not. He also referred repeatedly to a complete relief register recording every family helped after the collapse. That register, he wrote, had been placed apart from the correspondence because it contained the clearest evidence of who gave, who received, and why the payments continued after the mine closed. Daniel looked around the compartment again. If the letters were the wall file, where did he put the ledger? No answer appeared in the unsent correspondence. The final sheet ended with a promise that the register would be protected until someone trustworthy could preserve it publicly. Hannah searched the cavity once more, feeling along the back and sides. Her fingers touched something flat beneath the lowest tray. Miguel helped lift the wooden frame, revealing a sealed envelope wrapped in waxed cloth. Unlike the other papers, it bore no family name, date, or accounting notation. The handwriting across the front matched Samuel Evans's letters. Hannah carried it to the record desk and placed it beneath the afternoon light. 4 words had been written carefully across the faded paper. For whoever finds these. The room fell silent. The envelope remained sealed between them. Holding the explanation the chief clerk had hidden with the miner's family letters more than a century before, Hannah rested both hands on the edge of the record desk while the sealed envelope lay beneath the afternoon light. The words, "for whoever finds these," seemed less like an address than a request. Eleanor examined the wax carefully before nodding. "The seal is original. We should document it before opening." Daniel photographed the front, back, and edges. Miguel stood quietly beside the hidden wall compartment, surrounded by the letters his grandfather and other miners had helped preserve. Only after every detail had been recorded did Hannah slide a thin blade beneath the brittle seal. The wax cracked softly. Inside was a folded statement written in Samuel Evans's careful hand. Hannah began reading aloud. "If these papers remain together, then someone has found what the company wished forgotten." Evans explained that in the weeks before the collapse, miners had repeatedly reported damaged support timbers and unstable sections underground. Their complaints were delayed, minimized, or entered into temporary notes that never reached the permanent safety books. After the collapse, company representatives claimed several immigrant miners had ignored instructions and caused the disaster through careless work. Evans wrote that this account was false. The men blamed publicly had been among those who warned the office most often. Daniel's expression hardened, but he said nothing. Hannah continued. Evans described being ordered to revise payroll records, remove certain accident reports, and keep relief payments separate from official company accounts. He admitted that he obeyed some instructions because he feared losing access to the records entirely. "I chose silence in public," he wrote, "so that I might preserve the truth in private." The sentence struck Hannah painfully. She understood what it meant to survive by remaining quiet, though her own losses seemed small beside the burden Evans had carried. The statement explained that after the mine closed, workers who still had savings pooled their money to help injured miners, widows, children, and families forced from company housing. Clerks used leftover office funds when possible. Townspeople supplied food, coal, blankets, medicine, and train fare. None of it was charity organized by the company. It was a private effort maintained by men and women who knew official help would never come. Evans recorded every contribution and every recipient in a separate relief register. The family letters had been kept as supporting proof because they carried dates, names, and personal accounts no revised ledger could erase. He hid the correspondence in the wall and concealed the register elsewhere after realizing company officials were removing pages from payroll and accounting books. "I do not ask the finder to punish the dead," Hannah read. "I ask only that the living know who was blamed, who suffered, and who refused to abandon their neighbors." The final lines were even simpler. "Restore the names. Let the families know they were remembered." Hannah lowered the paper. For several moments, no one moved. The office was filled with the ordinary sounds of the old buildings settling in the cooling air. Miguel finally spoke. "My grandfather knew." His voice was rough with emotion. "He knew the company's story was a lie." Eleanor placed the statement inside a protective sleeve, and Evans knew the official records might outlive the truth unless someone preserved both. Daniel looked toward the bundles arranged by surname. "These letters are not just personal history anymore. They explain why the public record is incomplete." Over the next several days, Eleanor invited 2 members of the Regional Mining History Society to review copies of the statement and supporting correspondence. They met inside the museum after closing hours, comparing dates from the letters with surviving safety reports, payroll books, and newspaper accounts. The historians remained cautious, but neither dismissed the evidence. One pointed out that several articles published after the collapse repeated company statements almost word for word, while omitting earlier reports of structural problems. Another noticed that the names of immigrant miners appeared prominently in blame-focused coverage, but rarely in later lists of injured workers or displaced families. Hannah listened as the documents gradually formed a coherent record. Every letter answered one question while creating another, but the central truth was becoming harder to deny. The miners had been blamed publicly while quietly helping the very families most harmed by the disaster. News of the hidden correspondence spread through local historical circles. Some people worried that reopening the event would bring anger into the community. Others argued that avoiding the truth had already caused harm by erasing families from the town's history. Hannah refused interviews, insisting the documents needed review before public claims were made. She had not bought the mining office to become the face of a controversy. She only wanted the letters treated honestly. Thomas Granger returned to the office after reading Eleanor's preliminary report. This time his questions sounded different. He examined Evans's statement, the altered payroll pages, and the matching relief receipts without rushing. "I was concerned that people would build a story before the evidence was ready," he said. "But this is stronger than rumor." Hannah met his eyes. "Do you believe Evans Thomas?" Considered his answer. "I believe the documents support one another. I believe the official record is missing important facts. And I believe these families deserve a serious review." It was not an apology, but it was support. He offered to help arrange a formal preservation meeting and recommended that all originals remain secured through the museum. Eleanor accepted immediately. Miguel spent the following days reviewing the newly discovered bundles, one surname at a time. He recognized names his mother had mentioned during childhood, names connected to neighbors, godparents, and families who had left town together. Daniel helped build a chart showing relationships between workers, relatives, and recipients of relief. Several letters referred to the same households across different months, proving the support had continued far longer than official records suggested. Near the end of the week, Miguel opened a folder labeled Alvarez. His hands trembled before he touched the first page. Inside were letters from several branches of his family, including one written by his grandfather and another signed by his grandmother. The documents described deliveries of flour and coal, but they also listed aid received after his grandfather was injured and unable to work. Miguel read the amount twice, then looked toward Hannah. "They weren't only helping others," he whispered. "My family was one of the families they save." Miguel remained seated for a long time after reading the letters bearing his family's name. Hannah did not interrupt him. Some discoveries required silence before words could follow. When he finally looked up, his eyes were moist but steady. "My grandmother always insisted people in this town looked after one another after the mine closed," he said quietly. "Most of us thought she was remembering harder times through kinder memories." He rested his hand on the stack of letters. She wasn't remembering kindness. She was remembering the truth. That realization became the beginning of something larger than any of them expected. Rather than announcing dramatic conclusions, Eleanor suggested inviting descendants of the families named in the correspondence to view copies of the documents themselves. "History belongs first to the people who lived it," she said. Hannah agreed. Every original letter remained protected inside the museum archive, while carefully prepared copies were arranged in chronological order. Daniel organized family names, dates, and supporting records so visitors could follow the evidence step by step instead of relying on anyone's interpretation. Within 2 weeks, the museum's meeting room filled with descendants from across the county and neighboring towns. Some had traveled only a few miles. Others had driven several hours after hearing that forgotten family records had been discovered inside the abandoned mining office. There were no reporters and no television cameras. The gathering felt more like a family reunion than a public meeting. Hannah welcomed everyone, then quietly stepped aside. She had found the letters, but they belonged to the people reading them. Eleanor explained how the documents had been preserved. Daniel described the process of comparing every letter with census records, payroll books, financial summaries, church registers, and surviving county documents. He emphasized that every conclusion rested upon multiple sources rather than a single discovery. The careful approach reassured those listening. People moved slowly around the tables, studying copies of letters arranged beneath family names. One elderly woman stopped suddenly and covered her mouth. She pointed toward a handwritten note signed by her great-grandmother. "I've heard those words before," she whispered. "My mother used to repeat that sentence every Christmas." Another visitor unfolded a worn family Bible from a cloth bag. Births, marriages, and deaths recorded inside matched names appearing in the hidden correspondence. Daniel carefully photographed the pages with permission. Across the room, a retired railroad worker produced several faded photographs inherited from his grandfather. One showed miners and their families gathered outside a boarding house during winter. On the back, someone had written several names. 4 matched names already listed in Samuel Evans's correspondence. Miguel quietly shared copies of his grandparents' letters. Others responded by bringing handwritten recipes, funeral notices, school certificates, and postcards that had survived inside dresser drawers and attic trunks for generations. Individually, they seemed ordinary. Together, they restored lives that official records had only partially remembered. Hannah walked from table to table, listening more than speaking. She realized that every family carried small pieces of the same story. No single household possessed the complete history. Only by placing their memories together did the larger picture become visible. Eleanor smiled as another descendant recognized a surname from the relief receipts. "Archives preserve documents," she said softly to Hannah. "Families preserve people." During the afternoon, Daniel pinned a large county map to one wall. As descendants identified where their relatives had lived, worked, or relocated after the collapse, colored markers gradually spread across the valley and neighboring towns. The movement of families closely followed details described in the letters and financial records. The documents and family memories supported one another with remarkable consistency. By evening, Daniel had assembled a comprehensive report containing copies of the correspondence, payroll comparisons, financial summaries, photographs, diary entries, church records, census information, and family documents contributed that day. Every statement cited supporting evidence. Every uncertain point remained clearly identified. Hannah admired the restraint. The report sought understanding rather than accusation. Eleanor submitted the completed report, along with requests from numerous descendants, to the State Historical Preservation Office. Several weeks later, an official response arrived, acknowledging receipt of the material. After an initial review, state historians concluded that the newly discovered correspondence, combined with corroborating archival records and family documentation, justified a formal historical review of the mining community's surviving records. The letter requested temporary access to the original family letters, Samuel Evans's statement, the payroll books recovered beneath the office, and the financial documents located in the county archive. Eleanor read the letter aloud inside the museum, while Hannah, Daniel, Miguel, and Thomas listened. When she finished, the room remained quiet. Thomas finally spoke. "This is exactly what should happen." Hannah looked at the stack of carefully protected documents. Only months earlier, she had stood alone outside a courthouse with $327 and no clear future. Now, those same steady hands that had signed divorce papers were helping carry forgotten history toward the people entrusted to preserve it. Daniel smiled. "The evidence is finally leaving this town." Miguel looked around the museum filled with copies of family letters and photographs. "No," he said gently, "the truth is finally coming home." The state historians arrived on a cold morning, carrying archival cases, portable scanners, magnifying lenses, and a list of questions longer than the mining office itself. Hannah watched from the doorway as Eleanor signed the transfer forms that allowed the original letters and Samuel Evans's statement to be examined under supervision. The process was slower and more exacting than anyone expected. Each sheet was measured, photographed, tested beneath different light, and compared with known company documents from the same period. Ink, paper, handwriting, watermarks, and binding methods were all reviewed. The underground payroll books were examined beside the county archive records. The replacement pages were dated to a later period than the original ledger. The torn accounting sheets showed clean removal rather than accidental loss. The chief clerk's handwriting matched signatures preserved in tax records, employment forms, and routine correspondence. For 3 days, the historians worked without offering conclusions. Hannah understood their caution, but waiting made every hour feel heavier. Miguel came each morning and sat near the museum reading room, though he rarely spoke. Daniel continued organizing supporting material, while Thomas handled arrangements for a public meeting requested by the state review team. On the 4th afternoon, the lead historian closed the final folder and addressed them. "The letters are authentic," she said. "The Evans statement is consistent with the period, the handwriting, and the surviving company files. The payroll alterations occurred after the collapse. The financial records confirm continued relief payments. The family materials provide independent corroboration." Miguel released a breath as though he had been holding it for years. Hannah looked toward the preserved letters. Authentication did not change what they said, but it changed whether others could dismiss them. The state office issued a preliminary finding that the official history of the collapse was materially incomplete. It found no reliable evidence supporting the long-repeated claim that immigrant miners caused the disaster through disobedience. Instead, surviving complaints suggested serious concerns about unstable supports had been raised before the collapse. The review also recognized that workers, clerks, and townspeople had organized private relief for affected families after company operations ended. A formal public meeting was scheduled in the old community hall. By sunset, every seat was taken. Descendants filled the front rows with family photographs, Bibles, letters, and worn documents resting on their laps. Others stood along the walls. Hannah sat beside Miguel, Daniel, and Eleanor, while Thomas faced the audience from a small table near the stage. The state historians presented their findings without drama. They showed copies of the altered payroll pages, relief receipts, family correspondence, and Evans's statement. Dates and signatures appeared on a large screen. One piece of evidence connected carefully to the next. The room remained silent, except for an occasional whispered recognition when a family name appeared. When the presentation ended, descendants were invited to speak. An elderly man described how his grandfather had refused to discuss the collapse, but kept a miner's lamp beside his bed until the day he died. A woman read from her great-grandmother's Bible, where several children's names matched the relief letters. Miguel carried copies of his grandparents' correspondence to the front. He explained that his grandfather had both delivered aid and received it after being injured. For years, he said, our family remembered only that neighbors helped us. We did not know those same neighbors had been written out of the story. His voice shook, but he continued, these records give us back more than names. They give us the truth about who our families were. Thomas rose after him. He looked older beneath the hall lights than Hannah remembered from his first visit to the mining office. As chairman of the Historical Preservation Board, I urged caution when these documents were found, he began. Caution was appropriate, but I also failed to understand how deeply the existing history had already harmed families by presenting an incomplete account as settled fact. He paused and turned toward the descendants. For that, I am sorry. No applause followed immediately. The apology settled quietly through the room. Then one person began clapping, and others joined until the sound filled the hall. Thomas did not smile. He simply nodded and returned to his seat. The state historians announced that county exhibits, educational materials, and archived summaries would be revised to reflect the authenticated evidence. The names already identified through the letters and supporting records would be restored wherever documentation allowed. Yet one problem remained. The complete relief register mentioned by Samuel Evans had still not been found. Without it, some families could be acknowledged only indirectly. After the meeting, Hannah returned to the mining office with Daniel, Eleanor, Miguel, and Thomas. They intended only to review the building before securing it for the night. The hidden wall compartment had already been emptied, documented, and cleaned. But Eleanor wanted one final inspection before the panel was replaced. Daniel held a flashlight while Hannah examined the narrow cavity again. Near the bottom, she noticed that one vertical support did not rest flush against the floor. Miguel knelt beside her and pressed it gently. The board shifted inward. Behind it was a space no wider than a hand. Thomas brought a small mirror from the tool cabinet and angled it toward the darkness. Something metallic reflected the beam. They removed the support carefully and reached inside. Hannah's fingers closed around a narrow iron handle. Together, she and Miguel pulled out a long archival case, blackened with age but still sealed. Dust covered the lid. Across the top, beneath the grime, faint painted letters appeared. Eleanor wiped them carefully with a soft cloth. The words emerged one by one. Master Register. The iron case was carried to the museum before anyone attempted to open it. Eleanor insisted that every step be documented exactly as the earlier discoveries had been. The following morning, with state historians, Thomas, Daniel, Miguel, and Hannah gathered around a large archival table. The worn metal clasps were released one at a time. Inside rested a thick ledger wrapped in faded linen. Time had darkened the cover, but the title remained readable in careful ink. Relief Register, it said, followed by the year of the mine collapse. Beneath it, in Samuel Evans's handwriting, appeared a smaller note. Prepared so no family will be forgotten. Hannah felt the room grow still. Every clue they had followed, from the first locked document box beneath the loose floorboard to the hidden wall compartment and Evans's final letter, had pointed toward this single book. Eleanor unfolded the protective cloth while wearing fresh cotton gloves. The binding was dry but remarkably sound. Daniel photographed every page before anyone turned it. The first entries explained the purpose of the register. Evans had listed every household receiving assistance after the disaster, every miner contributing wages, every clerk recording distributions, and every volunteer delivering supplies. Nothing was organized by status or nationality. Families appeared simply as neighbors. The following pages contained names, hundreds of them. Beside each family were dates, addresses, numbers of children, illnesses, injuries, supplies delivered, train fares paid, funeral costs covered, and the names of those who had quietly helped. Hannah watched Miguel lean forward until his hands rested on the edge of the table. His grandparents' names appeared exactly where Evans's correspondence suggested they would. The ledger confirmed not only that they had received assistance after his grandfather's injury, but that months later they had resumed helping other families once they had recovered. Miguel smiled through tears. "He never stopped," he whispered. "Even after someone helped him, he kept helping others." Daniel continued turning pages carefully. Every few entries revealed another surname already recovered from letters. Family Bibles, payroll books, or church records. Yet dozens of additional families appeared for the first time. The missing names had survived exactly where Evans promised they would. Eleanor compared the register with the altered payroll books and damaged accounting records. Every surviving financial withdrawal found its matching recipient. Every relief receipt connected to a household. Every question that had remained incomplete since Hannah first opened the locked metal box beneath the office floor finally found an answer inside the register. The state historian spent several weeks authenticating the ledger with the same care given to the earlier discoveries. Handwriting matched Samuel Evans's verified correspondence. Paper, ink, page numbering, and accounting methods were consistent with the period. More importantly, the names aligned independently with census records, church registers, family documents, photographs, diaries, and the letters recovered from beneath the mining office. The evidence formed one complete history instead of scattered fragments. When the review concluded, the State Historical Office issued its final report. The report formally recognized that the previous public history of the collapse had omitted essential evidence concerning the relief effort, the altered payroll records, and the treatment of immigrant mining families. It restored the documented families to the historical record and acknowledged the organized support provided by miners, clerks, and townspeople after the disaster. For many descendants, The correction meant more than seeing familiar names printed in an official publication. It meant that stories preserved only around kitchen tables and family gatherings had finally been recognized beyond their own homes. Several months later, the town gathered again, this time outdoors beside the restored mining office. The weathered building looked much as Hannah had first found it, but careful repairs had stabilized the porch, replaced broken windows, and preserved the original record room where the discoveries began. A simple memorial stood nearby. Rather than listing only those who died in the collapse, it honored every documented family recorded in Samuel Evans' relief register and recognized the miners, clerks, volunteers, and neighbors who refused to abandon them. Descendants walked slowly along the engraved names. Some paused to place flowers. Others rested their hands quietly against the stone. Miguel brought copies of his grandparents' letters for younger members of his family to read. Children who had never heard the full story asked questions their parents could now answer with confidence. Thomas stood beside Hannah as visitors entered the restored office. "I spent years protecting buildings," he said. "I forgot that history also belongs to the people inside them." Hannah smiled gently. "Now both have been preserved. Inside, display cases held copies of the family letters, payroll books, relief receipts, photographs, maps, diary pages, and selected entries from the master register. The originals remained safely protected in climate-controlled archives, but every visitor could follow the story from beginning to end. The exhibit did not focus on blame. It focused on remembrance. Samuel Evans's final message appeared near the exit, displayed exactly as he had written it. "Restore the names. Let the families know they were remembered." Eleanor volunteered as the museum's historical advisor, helping visitors understand how ordinary documents could preserve extraordinary truths. Daniel developed educational materials for local schools, showing students how careful research, patience, and multiple sources could rebuild forgotten history without exaggeration. Miguel became one of the museum's most devoted guides. Whenever descendants visited searching for familiar names, he welcomed them with quiet understanding, because he knew what it felt like to find family waiting inside an old ledger. Hannah never imagined any of it when she left the courthouse, with only $327 and a life that seemed to have narrowed to almost nothing. She had bought an abandoned mining office for $120, simply because it was all she could afford, and because restoring old places gave her something steady to hold on to. She thought she was saving a forgotten building. Instead, the building had entrusted her with forgotten people. Sometimes visitors asked why she had never sold the property after its discoveries became widely known. Hannah always gave the same answer. "It was never really mine," she would say. "I was only the person who arrived when it was finally time for the story to be found." On quiet afternoons, she still unlocked the museum door before anyone else arrived. She would pause for a moment beside the old record desk, remembering the loose floorboard that had changed everything. The room no longer felt abandoned. Children's voices echoed through the exhibits. Families compared photographs. Volunteers answered questions. History had returned. Not because a mystery ended with hidden treasure, but because ordinary letters, careful records, and simple acts of kindness had survived long enough for someone to listen. Hannah often thought about Samuel Evans riding alone beneath dim lamplight, preserving names he feared the world would forget. More than a century later, those names were spoken again. The families were remembered. The truth had found its place. And in helping restore a community's history, Hannah quietly found her own.